They called him worthless, a broken man who couldn't even saddle a horse properly. But what they didn't know about the quiet ranch hand-mucking stables in the Texas heat would soon have an entire cavalry unit standing at attention. The sun blazed mercilessly over the Broken Arrow Ranch as Thaddeus Mackenzie bent over a pile of manure, his weathered hands gripping the shovel handle until his knuckles turned white. Sweat dripped from his graying beard onto the dirt floor of the stable, each drop mixing with years of shame he carried like a stone in his chest. At 52, his back ached with every movement, but it was nothing compared to the weight of watching younger men treat him like he was nothing more than a piece of broken furniture. Jeremiah Caldwell's voice cut through the morning air like a whip crack. The ranch foreman strutted into the stable, his boots clicking against the wooden planks with the arrogance of a man who'd never known real hardship. His cold gray eyes surveyed Mackenzie's work with the kind of disgust usually reserved for something you'd scrape off your boot. Caldwell spat into the hay beside Mackenzie's feet. "Move faster, old man. Mr. Harrison's got important guests coming today, and I won't have this place looking like a pigsty because you can't keep up." His words dripped with contempt as he circled Mackenzie like a vulture sizing up its prey. Mackenzie's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. He'd learned long ago that silence was his only shield against men like Caldwell. The foreman stepped closer, his shadow falling over the veteran like a dark cloud. "You hear me talking to you, Mackenzie? Or has all that whiskey finally rotted what's left of your brain?" The other ranch hands gathered at the stable entrance, their laughter echoing off the walls as they watched their daily entertainment unfold. To them, Mackenzie was nothing more than a circus act, the broken soldier who'd lost everything and now scraped horse manure for food and shelter. But Mackenzie straightened his shoulders, his steel blue eyes meeting Caldwell's stare for just a moment. Something flickered there, something dangerous that made Caldwell take half a step back before catching himself. Mackenzie's voice came out as steady as bedrock when he finally spoke. "I hear you just fine, Mr. Caldwell." The foreman's face flushed red with anger at the quiet defiance in Mackenzie's tone. He raised his hand as if to strike, but something in the old man's posture stopped him cold. There was something about the way Mackenzie stood, straight-backed despite his years of labor, shoulders squared like a man who'd faced down worse threats than a ranch foreman's temper. Instead, Caldwell settled for grabbing the shovel from Mackenzie's hands and throwing it across the stable. "Clean this mess up with your bare hands. Maybe that'll teach you some respect." He turned on his heel and stormed out, his boots echoing his fury with every step. As the laughter of the other workers faded into the distance, Mackenzie knelt down and began picking up the scattered tools. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the effort it took to keep himself from doing something he might regret. Because buried beneath years of humiliation and broken dreams was a man who'd once commanded the respect of thousands. But none of them knew that the sound of approaching hoofbeats in the distance would change everything in the next few hours. And when the dust settled, every man on that ranch would understand exactly who they'd been treating like dirt. The hoofbeats grew louder, thundering across the dusty plains like rolling thunder. Mackenzie's head snapped up from his work, his trained ear immediately recognizing something the other ranch hands couldn't: the precise rhythm of military horses moving in formation. His heart began to pound against his ribs as memories he'd buried deep started clawing their way to the surface. Caldwell burst back into the stable, his face twisted with panic. "Mackenzie, get those horses ready now. We got cavalry coming, and Mr. Harrison wants this place looking perfect." The foreman's earlier arrogance had evaporated, replaced by the nervous energy of a man whose job depended on impressing the wrong people. Through the stable doors, Mackenzie could see a cloud of dust rising on the horizon. The sound of jangling spurs and creaking leather grew closer with each passing second. His hands moved automatically, preparing the horses, but his mind was somewhere else entirely, back on battlefields where that same sound meant the difference between victory and death. The other ranch hands scrambled around like chickens in a storm, trying to make themselves look busy, but Mackenzie noticed something they didn't: the way Caldwell kept glancing at him with suspicious eyes, as if wondering why the old drunk seemed so calm when everyone else was falling apart. A young ranch hand named Billy stumbled into the stable, his face pale with excitement and fear. "Mr. Caldwell, sir. There's a whole company of soldiers riding up the main road. The one in front's got more gold on his uniform than I ever seen." Caldwell cursed under his breath and grabbed Mackenzie by the shoulder, his fingers digging in like claws. "Listen to me, old man. You keep your mouth shut when these soldiers get here. Don't embarrass this ranch with your drunken rambling. You understand?" Mackenzie looked down at Caldwell's hand on his shoulder, then slowly raised his eyes to meet the foreman's gaze. For a moment, something passed between them. Something that made Caldwell's grip loosen and his confidence waver. "I understand perfectly, Mr. Caldwell." The sound of horses pulling to a halt outside the stable made everyone freeze. Heavy boots hit the ground with military precision, followed by the sharp commands of officers organizing their men. Mackenzie's pulse quickened as he heard a voice he hadn't heard in 10 years. A voice that belonged to a man who'd once served under his command. Caldwell straightened his vest and plastered a fake smile across his face as he prepared to greet their unexpected visitors. "Remember what I said, Mackenzie." Not a word, but as the first blue uniform appeared in the stable doorway, Mackenzie felt something stirring inside him that had been dormant for far too long. The way the young officer carried himself, the respect in his voice as he spoke to his men, the gleaming brass buttons that caught the sunlight, it all reminded Mackenzie of who he used to be. And when the officer's eyes swept across the stable and landed on the weathered ranch hand standing in the shadows, Mackenzie saw something that made his blood run cold. Recognition. The kind that could either save him or destroy what little life he had left. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb stepped into the stable, his polished boots clicking against the wooden floor with the measured cadence of a man who'd spent his life in uniform. The afternoon sun caught the silver eagles on his shoulders, but it was his eyes that commanded attention. Sharp, intelligent, and currently fixed on the figure hunched over a pile of horsetack in the corner. Caldwell rushed forward like an eager puppy, his hands clasped behind his back in what he probably thought was a military pose. "Colonel Webb, sir. Welcome to Broken Arrow Ranch. I'm Jeremiah Caldwell, foreman of this operation. How can we be of service to the United States Army?" Webb's gaze never left Mackenzie, who had gone perfectly still except for his hands, which continued their work with the steady precision of a man trying to remain invisible. The colonel's weathered face showed no emotion, but something flickered behind his eyes. Surprise, confusion, and perhaps a hint of something deeper. "We're conducting a survey of local resources for a planned fort construction," Webb said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "We'll need to assess your livestock, water supply, and—" His words trailed off as Mackenzie slowly turned around. The two men looked at each other across the dusty stable, and time seemed to stop. Webb's face went pale beneath his tan, his mouth opening slightly as if he'd seen a ghost. Mackenzie straightened to his full height, and for a moment the broken ranch hand disappeared, replaced by something else entirely, something that made the air itself feel different. Caldwell, oblivious to the tension crackling between the two men, continued his nervous chatter. "Of course, Colonel. Whatever the Army needs, we're happy to provide. Though I should mention, some of our workers aren't exactly reliable." He shot a meaningful glance at Mackenzie. "We've got this old drunk here who causes more problems than he solves." Webb's jaw tightened, his eyes never leaving Mackenzie's face. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, but there was something dangerous lurking beneath the surface. "Is that so, Mr. Caldwell? And what exactly makes you think this man is unreliable?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gunpowder explosion. Mackenzie felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he watched Webb's expression shift from shock to something that looked suspiciously like anger. Not at him, but at the situation he'd found his old commander in. Caldwell, encouraged by what he mistook for interest, warmed to his subject. "Well, sir, he's just a broken-down old soldier who can't handle his liquor. Probably saw too much action in the war, if you know what I mean. We keep him around out of Christian charity. But he's more trouble than he's worth." The silence that followed was deafening. Webb's hands clenched into fists at his sides, and Mackenzie could see the vein pulsing in the colonel's temple. The younger officer who'd entered behind Webb looked confused, glancing between his commander and the ranch hand as if trying to solve a puzzle. Webb took a step forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Mr. Caldwell, I think there's something you should know about your broken-down old soldier." Mackenzie shook his head almost imperceptibly, a silent plea for Webb to let sleeping dogs lie. But the colonel had already made his decision, and Mackenzie could see in his eyes that there would be no going back. The moment of truth had arrived, and everything Mackenzie had built, or rather everything he'd hidden behind, was about to come crashing down around him. Webb's voice cut through the stable like a cavalry saber. "Mr. Caldwell, the man you just called a broken-down old soldier is Colonel Thaddeus Mackenzie. The same Colonel Mackenzie who held Antietam Creek for 3 days against impossible odds. The same man who saved my life and the lives of 200 soldiers under his command." The words hit Caldwell like a physical blow. His face went from smug confidence to ash-white terror in the span of a heartbeat. The other ranch hands who had gathered to watch the show suddenly found their boots extremely interesting, shuffling backwards as if distance could somehow protect them from what they'd just heard. Mackenzie closed his eyes and let out a slow breath. 10 years of carefully constructed anonymity had just evaporated like morning dew. He'd worked so hard to become nobody, to disappear into the crowd of broken men who'd survived the war but lost everything else. Now that protective shell was cracking apart, exposing wounds that had never properly healed. "Colonel?" Caldwell's voice came out as barely a whisper. But you're just what?" Webb stepped closer to the foreman, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "Just a man who gave everything for his country? Just a hero who lost his family, his fortune, and his reputation because politicians needed someone to blame for their failures?" The younger officer behind Webb snapped to attention as the pieces fell into place. Even the horses seemed to sense the shift in the air, snorting and stamping nervously in their stalls. Mackenzie stood frozen in the center of it all, watching his carefully built new life crumble like a house of cards in a windstorm. Caldwell's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He looked from Webb to Mackenzie and back again, trying to process the impossible truth. This man he'd been treating like garbage, this broken ranch hand he'd humiliated daily, was a decorated war hero who'd commanded thousands of men in battle. I didn't know," Caldwell stammered, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air in the stable. "He never said. I mean, how was I supposed to?" Mackenzie finally found his voice, though it came out rough as sandpaper. "Because I didn't want you to know, Marcus. I came here to disappear, not to be remembered." His eyes met Webb's with a mixture of gratitude and resignation. Some things are better left buried. But Webb shook his head firmly. "Not this, Thaddeus. Not you." He turned back to Caldwell, his voice carrying the full weight of military authority. "This man single-handedly changed the course of the war. When everyone else retreated, he stood firm. When politicians threw him to the wolves, he took it with dignity. If you were Caldwell, what would you do? Apologize desperately and hope for forgiveness, or double down and claim you were just following orders? Tell me in the comments. I need to know how you'd handle discovering you've been humiliating a war hero. Because what Caldwell decided next would determine whether this confrontation ended in redemption or complete destruction." The ranch hands began whispering among themselves, their voices carrying a mixture of awe and fear. Some of them were veterans themselves, and they knew the stories. They'd heard the legends whispered around campfires and in saloons across the frontier. And now they realized they'd been working alongside a living piece of history. Mackenzie straightened his shoulders, and for the first time in years, he looked like the man he used to be. Caldwell dropped to his knees in the hay-strewn stable floor, his whole body shaking like a leaf in a thunderstorm. The sight of the arrogant foreman groveling sent shockwaves through every ranch hand present. Words tumbled from his mouth in a desperate rush. "Colonel Mackenzie, sir, I had no idea. Please, you have to understand I never would have, if I'd known who you were." Mackenzie looked down at the man who'd made his life miserable for the past 3 years, and something unexpected stirred in his chest. Not satisfaction or revenge, but a deep, bone-weary sadness. "Get up, Caldwell. A man shouldn't grovel in the dirt, no matter what he's done." But Caldwell remained on his knees, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I called you worthless. I made you clean stables with your bare hands. I treated a war hero like a man who'd lost everything," Mackenzie finished quietly. "Which is exactly what I was, what I still am." He extended his hand to help Caldwell to his feet, but the foreman refused to take it, as if he didn't deserve even that small gesture of forgiveness. Webb watched the scene unfold with barely contained emotion. Behind him, more soldiers had gathered at the stable entrance, drawn by the commotion. When word spread that they were in the presence of the legendary Colonel Mackenzie, the whispers grew louder. Some of the younger soldiers had heard the stories from their fathers, tales of impossible courage and heartbreaking sacrifice. Young Billy, the ranch hand who'd announced the cavalry's arrival, stepped forward with tears in his eyes. "Colonel, sir, my pa fought at Antietam. He always said there was this officer who saved his whole regiment when they got pinned down by Confederate artillery." "That was you, wasn't it?" Mackenzie's throat tightened. He remembered that day, the screams of wounded men, the acrid smell of gunpowder, the impossible choice between retreat and annihilation. "Your father was a brave man, son. They all were." The stable had become a shrine to memory, with men who'd never known war standing beside those who'd lived through its horrors. But the weight of the moment was almost too much for Mackenzie to bear. He'd spent a decade trying to forget, trying to become invisible, and now the past was rushing back like a flood breaking through a dam. Webb stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm. "Thaddeus, you can't keep hiding from who you are. These men deserve to know they've been working alongside a genuine American hero." Mackenzie's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Hero?" His voice cracked with bitter laughter. "Marcus, do you know what I've been doing for the past 10 years? Drinking myself to sleep every night, trying to forget the faces of the men who died because of my orders, living in flop houses and working for men like Caldwell because I couldn't face the world that moved on without me." The silence stretched like a taut rope ready to snap. Every man in that stable could feel the weight of Mackenzie's pain, the crushing burden of survivor's guilt that had driven him into exile. But they could also see something else, the unbreakable core of honor that had sustained him through war and its aftermath. Webb's voice was steady as bedrock when he spoke. "And yet here you are, still standing, still fighting, even if it's just against your own demons." He turned to address the assembled men. "That's what makes a hero, gentlemen. Not the absence of fear or pain, but the courage to keep going despite them. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel." But Mackenzie wasn't finished. The dam had broken and years of suppressed emotion came pouring out. What he said next would either complete his redemption or shatter him entirely. Mackenzie's voice cracked like breaking glass as the words poured out of him. "You want to know why I disappeared, Marcus? Why I let everyone think I was dead? It's because I should be. Every man who died under my command should be standing here instead of me. I lived when better men didn't, and that's a weight I'll carry until my last breath." The stable fell silent except for the soft snorting of horses and the distant sound of wind through the eaves. Webb's face had gone pale, understanding finally dawning in his eyes. He'd wondered for years why his commanding officer had vanished after the war, why a man of Mackenzie's caliber had simply disappeared into the frontier like smoke. "Colonel," Webb said softly, "what happened at Petersburg wasn't your fault. The intelligence was wrong. No one could have known." "Stop." Mackenzie's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Don't you dare try to absolve me of what I did. I sent 200 boys into a trap because I trusted information that was 3 days old. I watched them die because I was too proud to admit I might be wrong." Caldwell, still kneeling in the dirt, looked up with confusion written across his tear-stained face. "Colonel, what are you talking about? Petersburg. That wasn't in any of the stories I heard." Webb closed his eyes, understanding the terrible burden his old commander had been carrying. "Thaddeus, you saved 3,000 men at Antietam. One mistake doesn't erase a lifetime of heroism." But Mackenzie shook his head violently, his hands trembling with the force of memory. "Those boys had families, Marcus. Wives who waited for letters that never came. Children who grew up without fathers because I was too stubborn to question orders from Washington." Young Billy stepped forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, my older brother died at Petersburg, Tommy Garrison. He was only 19. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and Mackenzie felt his knees nearly buckle. "I'm sorry," Mackenzie whispered, the words inadequate but all he had. "God help me. I'm so sorry." But Billy surprised everyone by stepping closer, his young face serious beyond his years. "Colonel, sir, Tommy wrote to us before that battle. He said his commanding officer was the finest man he'd ever known. Said you'd visit the wounded yourself, that you knew every soldier's name. He was proud to serve under you, even at the end." The revelation hit Mackenzie like a physical blow. He staggered backward, catching himself against a wooden post as tears he'd held back for a decade finally broke free. Around the stable, hardened men wiped their eyes, understanding for the first time the true cost of war, not just for those who died, but for those who lived with the weight of command. Webb stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. "That's what they never tell you about heroes, isn't it? That sometimes surviving is the hardest battle of all." Mackenzie looked around at the faces surrounding him, Caldwell still on his knees, the ranch hands standing with newfound respect, the soldiers who'd heard legends but were now seeing the broken man behind them. He was at a crossroads, and what he chose to do next would determine whether he remained a ghost of the past or finally found a way to live with his ghosts. The sound of approaching horses interrupted the moment, but these hoofbeats were different, urgent, desperate. Someone was riding hard toward the ranch, and whatever news they carried would change everything once again. A lone rider burst through the ranch gates, his horse lathered with sweat and foam flying from its mouth. The man in the saddle wore the uniform of a cavalry scout, his face grim with the kind of urgency that meant life or death. He pulled up short outside the stable, dust swirling around his mount as he leaped to the ground. "Colonel Webb," the scout shouted, his voice hoarse from hard riding. "Sir, we've got trouble, big trouble." He rushed into the stable, his eyes wild with panic as he spotted his commanding officer among the gathered men. Webb snapped into military mode instantly, his personal emotions shelved in favor of immediate necessity. "Report, Sergeant Morrison. What's the situation?" Morrison glanced nervously at the civilians present, but Webb waved him on. "Speak freely, Sergeant. What's happened?" "Sir, it's the Apache. Chief Running Bear's broken out of the reservation with about 50 warriors. They hit the Whitman homestead 2 hours ago, killed the whole family except for a little girl. She managed to hide and escape, but—" Morrison's voice cracked. "Sir, they're heading this way. Our scouts estimate they'll reach this area by sundown." The blood drained from every face in the stable. Apache raids were the stuff of nightmares on the frontier. Swift, brutal, and merciless. Caldwell finally scrambled to his feet, his earlier humiliation forgotten in the face of immediate danger. "How far out are they?" Webb demanded, his mind already calculating distances and response times. "Maybe 3 hours, sir. But here's the thing." Morrison hesitated, glancing again at the civilians. "They're not just raiding randomly. Word is Running Bear's looking for someone specific. Someone who fought against his brother at Canyon Creek 5 years ago." Mackenzie felt the world tilt beneath his feet. Canyon Creek. The name hit him like a physical blow, dragging up memories he'd tried desperately to bury alongside all the others. His hands began to shake as he remembered that day, the desperate fight in the narrow canyon, the impossible odds, and the terrible choice he'd been forced to make. Webb's eyes snapped to Mackenzie, understanding dawning in his expression. "Thaddeus, Canyon Creek, that was you, wasn't it? You led that operation." Mackenzie nodded slowly, his voice barely audible. "Running Bear's brother was Chief Stone Wolf. I had to choose between letting my men be slaughtered or—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The weight of that day, the decision that had saved 40 soldiers but cost the life of a chief's brother, pressed down on him like a boulder. "Sir," Morrison continued urgently, "the Apache have been asking questions in every settlement they've hit. They know he's out here somewhere. They know about the colonel." Caldwell's face went white as bone. "They're coming here? For him?" He pointed a shaking finger at Mackenzie. "You brought this down on us. Your past is going to get us all killed." But before anyone could respond, young Billy stepped forward, his jaw set with determination. "Then we fight. We don't hand over a hero to save our own skins." The other ranch hands murmured agreement, but Webb shook his head grimly. "Gentlemen, you don't understand. 50 Apache warriors against a handful of soldiers and civilians. Those aren't fighting odds. Those are dying odds." Mackenzie straightened slowly, and for the first time since Webb had arrived, he looked every inch the colonel he'd once been. His voice was steady, carrying the weight of command that no amount of humiliation could erase. "Then I'll ride out to meet them. End this before it starts." "Like hell you will," Webb shot back. "I didn't find you again just to watch you throw your life away on some misguided sense of guilt." Outside, the afternoon sun was already beginning its descent toward the horizon. Time was running out, and somewhere in the distance, 50 Apache warriors rode toward a reckoning that had been 10 years in the making. Mackenzie stood at the center of it all, faced with the hardest decision of his life: save himself and let innocent people die, or face his past one final time, and hope he was still the man who'd once held impossible lines against impossible odds. The sound of metal being checked and weapons being loaded filled the stable as every man present prepared for what might be their last fight. Mackenzie stepped out of the stable into the fading daylight, his weathered hand steady as he checked his rifle one final time. Behind him, Webb's soldiers and the ranch hands formed a ragged line of defense, but everyone knew the truth. They were preparing for a massacre, not a battle. The Apache appeared on the ridge like shadows materializing from the earth itself. 50 warriors on horseback, their war paint gleaming in the dying sun, formed a perfect crescent around the ranch. At their center rode Chief Running Bear, his face a mask of controlled fury, as his eyes swept the buildings below until they found the man he'd spent 5 years hunting. Mackenzie walked forward alone, his boots crunching on the dusty ground as he moved away from the others. Every step felt like walking through quicksand, but his spine remained straight, and his head held high. He was done running from his past. "Running Bear!" Mackenzie's voice carried across the distance between them, strong and clear despite the tremor in his chest. "You want me? Here I am. These people had nothing to do with Canyon Creek. Let them live, and we'll settle this between us." The Apache chief urged his horse forward, stopping just 50 yards away. When he spoke, his English was perfect, tinged with an accent that made every word sound like a death sentence. "Colonel Mackenzie, the man who killed my brother with his own hands, the man who broke his word and murdered Stonewolf under a flag of truce." Mackenzie felt the accusation hit him like a physical blow. Behind him, he heard Webb's sharp intake of breath. The soldiers had heard rumors about Canyon Creek, but never the full truth. "That's not what happened." "And you know it," Mackenzie replied, his voice steady despite the chaos in his heart. "Then tell me what happened," Running Bear demanded, his horse dancing nervously beneath him. "Tell these men why Stonewolf died when he came to negotiate peace." The words came slowly, each one carved from stone. "Your brother came to parley." "Yes, but he came with 20 warriors hidden in the rocks above. When my scout spotted them, he drew his knife. I had to choose between my men's lives and keeping the peace." Mackenzie's voice cracked. "I chose my men. I've regretted it every day since." Running Bear's face showed no emotion, but something flickered in his dark eyes. "And now? What do you choose now?" Mackenzie slowly unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall to the ground. "I choose to end this. Take me, but let these people live. They've got nothing to do with the sins of my past." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind whistling through the ranch buildings. Then Running Bear raised his hand, and the circle of warriors lowered their weapons. "You speak truth, Colonel. Stonewolf would have done the same to protect his people. There has been enough death between us." The Apache chief wheeled his horse around and led his warriors back into the gathering darkness, leaving Mackenzie standing alone in the dust, finally free from the ghosts that had haunted him for so long. As Webb and the others rushed to his side, Mackenzie realized something had changed inside him. The weight of command, the burden of impossible choices, they were still there, but now he could carry them without being crushed. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel. Mackenzie never returned to the ranch as a hired hand. Webb convinced him to accept a position training young officers at Fort Davis, where his experience could save lives instead of haunting him. Caldwell became his most unlikely ally, transforming the Broken Arrow into a refuge for veterans struggling with their own demons. And sometimes on clear desert nights, they would see smoke signals in the distance. Running Bear's people, living in peace at last, honoring the courage of an old soldier who'd finally learned to forgive himself. Now click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, with a twist so powerful you won't forget it anytime soon. Click on the video now.